Greetings, fellow classmates. My name is Eric Cox. And Warren Bennett said that in life, change is inevitable, but in business, change is vital. And I'm here to talk to you about Chapter 2, The Changing Environment of Organizations. And if you follow along with the PowerPoint, we have a lot of information to cover, so I'll dive right in with the overview. And PowerPoint slide number 2, we'll talk today about diversity. We'll talk about factors of diversity, and we'll talk about barriers to inclusion. And then we'll transition into globalization as we talk about the global market. We'll talk about how you can increase cultural competence and how important that is, and some cultural factors and impact. And then we'll talk about technology and how that's impacting organizations, and then we'll look at some ethical issues and challenges to our organizations to consider as managers. And then finally, we'll discuss some new employment relationships that are unique to our modern organizations. And then finally, we'll wrap up with the discussion question for the week. So if you'll follow along with me, we'll go ahead and transition to the next slide. So as we look at diversity in our modern organizations, diversity essentially just refers to variety, right? Observable and unobservable. And our text has a figure on 2.1 on page 46 if you want to look in there. And it talks about the 5 types of diversity. And the 5 types of diversity really refer to, the first one is surface level diversity. These are our observable diversity traits. These are race, age, ethnicity, gender, physical characteristics, and of course these are the things that we generally think of when we think of diversity efforts. But then there's the deep level or the unobservable type diversity factors. And these are like goals and values, personalities, decision-making styles, and attitudes. These are going to be a lot harder for you to understand or know from the surface, but important for you to know about the members of your team as you dive in and get to know the people on your team. Then we have separation, and separation deals with the differences in position or opinion reflecting opposition, especially in regarding group goals. And if you've ever worked on a group project for your schoolwork or in college, you definitely know what I'm talking about when we talk about diversity in terms of separation. If you go ahead and move with me to the next slide, we'll continue with the 5 types of diversity. The next one is variety, and variety deals with differences in types or categories such as expertise, knowledge, or functional background. And I would argue that this is an important thing to include in your team, is good diversity in terms of variety for the backgrounds and expertise. And then finally we have disparity, and that's the difference in concentration of valuable social assets or resources like rank or pay, decision-making authority, or status. If you move to the next slide, we'll talk about some barriers to diversity, things that can get in the way of our inclusion efforts in our organization. And again, the text has a great figure, 2.2 on page 52, and it lays out the different barriers that can get in the way of our inclusion efforts as managers. And the first one is the like me bias, and this should come as no surprise or shock to you, but people prefer to associate with those that are like themselves. The second one is stereotypes, and this is the belief about individuals or groups based on the idea that everyone in that group is the same or acts the same or has certain characteristics. Then we have prejudice, and prejudice can be an extremely negative barrier to inclusion, bigotry or intolerance for others or groups of folks. And then finally we have perceived threat of loss. Perceived threat of loss, we'll talk a little bit when we talk about cultural competence and globalism, but perceived threat of loss is when we perceive that there's a threat to career opportunities, and that by bringing in others or a diverse set of work employees, that this is going to get in the way of my own career opportunities, and that's going to result in people trying to protect their own kingdom and get in the way of the diversity efforts. Go ahead and move to the next slide, and we'll finish up with the barriers to diversity. Then we have ethnocentrism. Ethnocentrism, again, when we talk about being culturally competent, this is going to be a no-go if we're going to be culturally competent here in a minute. But ethnocentrism is a belief that one's own language, country, or cultural norms and rules are superior to others. And then finally, unequal access to organizational networks. If your organization is set up in such a way that you have to be at the right places or have lunch with the right people in order to get ahead, but certain people aren't getting those invites, then that's going to be a barrier to inclusion. And traditionally, we've seen that in terms of women and minorities not having equal access. We used to refer to this as the good old boy network, and it could be a real problem for our diversity efforts. So if you go ahead and move with me to slide number 7, we'll kind of transition from diversity into kind of a similar but expanding thought to globalization. As we've seen the trends in the market, we've seen that the marketplace has truly become global as technology and communication have made us be able to reach business across the world. And it's resulted in us having a need for cultural competence. And that's the ability to interact effectively with people of all different cultures. You might have managers, employees, and peers all across the world in different cultures and time zones. And cultural competence comes with 4 different components that the text lays out. The first one is an awareness of our own cultural worldview and our reactions to those who are different. And that essentially results in us needing to be self-aware. The second is our attitude towards cultural differences. We must be willing to understand other cultures. Thirdly, we must be knowledgeable of different worldviews and cultural practices, so be willing to learn. And then finally, cross-cultural skills. We must practice. So as an example, when I got ready to deploy to Afghanistan, we knew we'd be working with the Afghan forces. So one of the major points of emphasis for us was that we had to train in our cross-cultural competence and our cross-cultural skills. So not only in our job and the things that we'd be doing while we would be deployed, but also in the Afghan culture. And I had to learn a lot about the Afghan culture in the tribal region that I'd be working in so that I'd be able to understand and interact effectively, not just with Afghans, but with the Afghans that I'd be working with in that particular region. So let's move into the next slide and we'll talk about some specific cultural issues that you might encounter. The first one is individualism, and individualism is people in a culture define themselves primarily as individuals more than a group, and it won't surprise you to know that this is quite common in the United States. But then the converse to that is collectivism, and collectivism is when people in a culture base their identities and their affiliation with a group or an organization, almost looking at it like a family, and this is big in a culture, say, like Japan. And then we have power distance, and that's the extent to which people accept as normal unequal distribution of power. Clear lines of authority. Mexico expects clear lines of authority, where in Israel they're more comfortable with less clear lines of authority. And the U.S. is okay or has a mix of those cultural issues. And then we have uncertainty avoidance or preference for stability. This is the extent to which people feel threatened by unclear situations and prefer clear situations. All right, and that's Japan. In Japan, they prefer stability and clear lines and clear situations. In Sweden, they prefer or are okay with less stability or a lot more uncertainty. And again, in the U.S. is a mix. If you move to the next slide, we'll continue to talk about some specific cultural issues to include masculinity. Masculinity, also known as assertiveness or materialism, is the extent to which the dominant values in society are aggressiveness and acquisition of wealth and material versus relationships and people. Now, you might expect the U.S. to rank very high in this, but actually the U.S. ranks moderately in this particular cultural issue, whereas Japan ranks very high in this particular cultural issue. And then finally, we have long-term versus short-term values. And long-term values are values where focused on working on the future, projects that have long-term payoff and persistence, and this is going to be big in a culture like China, versus short-term values, which are more oriented on the past and the present, respect for tradition, social obligation, and you're going to see this in places like West Africa and Pakistan. Now, if you move to the next slide, we'll talk about why all this matters, or how you can deal with all this. How you can deal with all this, or what is important about all this, is that we maintain as organizations and as managers a global perspective. And a global perspective is just essentially a willingness to be open and learn from the alternative systems and meanings of other peoples and cultures, and a capacity to avoid assuming that people from everywhere are the same, embracing diversity. Not hard if you just recognize that people from California are not the same as people from Texas and New York, and vice versa. So not hard to embrace. All right, next slide. Now that we've talked about diversity and we've talked a little bit about globalism, let's talk a little bit about technology. So less the people and more about the machinery and its impact on the people. So technology has resulted in the U.S. transitioning from a manufacturing to a service-based economy. And service organization transforms resources into an intangible output, create time and place utility for customers. And since 1990, almost 90% of the jobs that have been created in the U.S. have been service-based. Well, what does this mean for managers? It means that the people that we're recruiting and training and retaining have a different skill set and different things that we're looking for versus the manufacturing jobs, right? right? Less skill, more knowledge, more customer base, that kind of thing, and that's changing the face of our organizations. If you go to the next slide, we'll continue to talk about the technology from the face of information technology. It's brought with it some advantages, certainly, but some disadvantages and some challenges as well. What advantages has it brought? Well, better access and collaboration, right? We can reach out across the globe, as we talked about. We can reach out to our employees at any time, anywhere, so that's great. However, it's brought more urgency. We can task hot at any given time, and it's given us less downtime and more stress. It also has brought with it some challenges to security, and as our information for our products and our services is available and maybe can get hacked or shared across with our competitors. And when we talk about information technology in terms of social media and what our employees can do even while they're at work, it's brought with it some loss of productivity at work as well. And all of that brought together has brought with it some organizational ethical challenges as well, which brings us to ethics and corporate governance on the next slide. So if you look at figure 2.3 on page 65 in your textbook, you'll see a nice figure on how to frame managerial ethics. And managerial ethics can be broken down, according to your text, into three main areas. They essentially fall into the categories of how the organization treats the individual, how the individual treats the organization, and how the organization and the individual deal with outside agents. Okay, and so how the organization treats its employees has to deal with hiring and firing, respect, privacy, that kind of stuff. Nobody wants to work in a toxic work environment. Nobody wants their hiring information or their pay to be privy to the entire organization or subject for discussion. At the same time, as employees, we owe it to our organization to reveal any conflicts of interest, to maintain confidentiality about it, where it is that we work, and be honest with our employers. Now, how employees and organizations treat other economic agents has to deal with how we're dealing with unions, how we're dealing with our stockholders, customers and competitors, those kind of things. Go ahead and move on to the next slide, and we'll talk a little bit about the stockholders when we talk about corporate governance. Corporate governance is an important topic that the book refers to, and corporate governance is essentially when you have a board of directors, and the board of directors are there to ensure that the CEO is making decisions and that the decisions of the company are being made in the interest of the stockholders and the shareholders, not just in the interest of the CEO, or at least ostensibly so. As we've seen throughout the 2000s and during the recession, that wasn't always the case, but essentially that's what the corporate governance is there for. Some further concerns or commentary about information technology. It's brought with it some privacy issues that need to be considered as well. Whenever you're dealing with information technology as your primary source for your organization, you got to be aware that customers and users are going to be concerned about things like what information is being gathered and how is it being used, and then of course what if it's being compromised. That's all great as long as we're being stored securely, but what if that information gets compromised, as it often is. And then finally, when we talk about ethics and corporate governance, we're talking about social responsibility. There's been a big push, almost as a response to the scandals of the 2000s, for social responsibility and social involvement from companies and organizations. Anytime an organization can get involved in the community or have a social good and a greater good, it's a good thing for the company. For example, my wife is human resources for a local company here, and one of their big things is Veterans Outreach and Habitat for Humanity. Why is it a good thing for a company to do social responsibility? Well, one, it helps the community and creates goodwill for the community, but it also creates a good brand image for the company as well. And so social responsibility is a good thing ethically for a company to do as well. It's kind of a win-win all around. So going to move on to the next slide, and we'll wrap up the discussion by talking about new employment relationships. Now, new employment relationships, as we've changed our organizations, we've seen changes to the environment, we've seen some changing employment relations. And the first one is the management of knowledge workers. Now, knowledge workers are those who they work for us, and they work there and because of what they know. Now, knowledge workers are like your computer scientists, your physical scientists, your engineers, computer software designers. Those kind of things are going to be your knowledge workers. Knowledge workers can essentially pick up and move and go work for any other company at any time just as well as they could work for us. So their loyalty is not so much going to be to us and an organization as it is going to be to what it is that they do. And so they have to be managed a little bit differently. And as you see there on the slide, they're going to prefer to work autonomously, and they might require a little bit different handling and even compensation than other employees if we want to retain them and keep them motivated to stay with our company. So go ahead and move to the next slide, and we'll talk a little bit about outsourcing and offshoring when we talk about new employment relationships. Outsourcing is the practice of hiring other firms to do work previously performed in-house, and it can be a fantastic alternative for an organization if it basically allows your company to focus on its core capabilities. However, it has very many times resulted in offshoring, and offshoring is when we've outsourced abroad to lower labor costs, and a lot of times that's resulted in the loss of domestic jobs, and very often, as the textbook pointed out, sometimes resulted in domestic workers training their replacements, which can create a lot of bad will and a lot of bad press. And so that's been that offshoring is another word for outsourcing for cheaper labor that can create a lot of controversy and ill will. So go ahead and move to the next slide. And then finally, new employment relationships. Let's wrap up by talking about the changing nature of psychological contracts. Psychological contract is a set of expectations regarding what a person will contribute to an organization and what the organization will contribute to the individual. And so essentially what an individual will contribute to an organization is going to be, I will give you my skills, my experience, my time, my loyalty, my energy, but in return, I expect something. Nothing is for free. And so in return, you're going to give me pay, a career, job opportunities, promotion, etc. For example, one of the things that I've always liked about the Air Force is it's very clear in its expectations. I'm going to give you, in essence, 20 years of commitment, and in return, you're going to give me pay, you're going to give me promotion opportunities, and at the end of 20 years, you're going to give me a pension, and you're going to give me health care, and you're going to give me education benefits, and those kind of things. And so it's a very clear-cut psychological contract between the Air Force and myself, and that's worked out very well for me. Now, what psychological contract your employees and the organization are going to have is going to really vary wildly, though, depending on the employee, because think back to where we started this discussion. Diversity is going to play into that. The cultural factors are going to play into that. The type of employee, knowledge worker versus an outsourced worker, all those kind of things are going to factor into that. So all of those things are going to factor into the psychological contract that your employees are going to have with the organization. So that being said, it leads into my discussion question for the week. And my discussion question for you guys this week is, with so many factors to consider in the modern organization, diversity, globalization, technology, ethics, new employment relationships, how can we manage the psychological contracts across our workforce to ensure that we are getting the most from our employees, as well as recruiting and retaining top talent? And so I very much look forward to the discussion. I look forward to what you guys have to say on it, and I thank you for your guys' time. So just to wrap up, we talked about the changing environment of organizations. We started by discussing diversity, factors of diversity, and barriers to inclusion. We talked about globalization and how to increase your cultural competence. We talked about technology and how that factored into the changing environment of the organization. We talked about some ethical challenges and corporate governance, and then we talked about new employment relationship and wrapped up by a discussion of psychological contract. And then finally, posed the discussion questions for you guys that I'm very much looking forward to hearing from you. Again, my name is Eric Cox. This has been Chapter 2, The Changing Environment of the Organization. I thank you all, and I look forward to working with you. Thanks.